Konnichiwa. World History Addicts Podcast do Iyokoso. Host no Devon desu. Welcome back to the World History Addicts podcast. I'm your host, Devon, and today we are back with the history of Japan, part 2. This episode will be about Japan under the 3 different shogunates and the era of chaos and bloodshed in between the 2nd and 3rd. From the 12th century to the 19th, we will watch as Japan becomes its most iconic self, full of battles, honor, and even the beginnings of modernity. Let's begin. Hey, Michelle.
Hello.
How are you doing? Yeah, so tell me about your trip to Japan. So, what stood out the most while you were there?
Goodness, what stood out the most? I feel like the politeness of the whole society, like politeness is highly valued, and like the also kindness, which I feel like are different things, but the kindness and the politeness of everybody, all the people in the service industry are like just fantastic. When I came back from Japan to the United States, in fact, like it was kind of a culture shock to suddenly
Kind of jarring, just have everyone be just kind of
cold and like just so indifferent and not mean. Like they're not trying to be rude or mean.
Really considerate the same way that they are in Japan.
Yeah, it's just like a totally different vibe. So I think that is one of the things that stood out the most for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that will probably be true across most Western countries. Because people just kind of think in terms of the individual. It's like, if I want to do something, then I'm going to do it. And if other people don't like it, well, that's kind of on them.
Mm-hmm.
But in Japan, it's all about just like, how will this affect other people? And how will this affect like the way that other people see me, like right in this moment?
Oh, 100%. The how other people see you and like the cultural, I would say the shame culture is so funny to me because like we were on a train and there was a sign on the train that like it was supposed to discourage people from getting on the train while the doors were closing, because basically if you do that you're holding up the train from departing. Yeah. And so it said don't squeeze yourself onto the train while the doors are closing, because if the doors close on you, what will hurt more than the doors closing on you is the stares of everybody around you. And I was like, only in Japan does shame hurt worse than pain. But
yeah, getting crushed by the doors is not good, but getting shamed by everyone around you is worse.
Is worse. Exactly.
Yeah. So where did you go in Japan? Like, what places did you visit?
So I lived in a prefecture in the south called Fukuoka Ken, and that is on the island of Kyushu. It's the most south island except for like the Okinawa islands. But of the 4 main islands of Hokkaido in the north, and then Honshu.
The Honshu's the biggest one, right?
Honshu is the biggest. It's got the Tokyo and the
the
Kyoto and Hiroshima. And then you've got Shikoku, which is just like kind of in the middle there.
It's like the southeast part, I think.
Mm-hmm. South. Yeah. It's kind of like where Honshu does kind of a bend, and Shikoku is right here under the bend.
Japan is like J-shaped.
Yeah. And then Kyushu is down here to the west. West. So kind of Japan does a little bit of a swoop, and down in the southwest is Kyushu, and then Fukuoka is at the north part of Kyushu. So we were actually very close to the tip of Korea. And so while I was in Japan, while I lived there, I took there's a ferry, a couple of different ferries actually, that you can take from the port at Fukuoka to Busan, which is on the tip of Korea, and then you can take the Korean bullet train up from Busan to Seoul. So I made that trip several times, so that was always very fun. But while I was in Japan, I wanted to travel everywhere. I didn't make it to Okinawa, but I went to all of the prefectures in Kyushu. and I think there were six. There was so Saga and Nagasaki. I went to those. I went to Miyazaki. I went to Kagoshima, and then I went to the southernmost. I think. Wait, no, is that Kagoshima? Yeah, it might be. And then, at the very tip, there's this teeny tiny island called Yakushima. And Yakushima is where they have these like really old cedar forests, and you can walk to these trees that are like as old as the oldest civilization in Japan, called the Jomon period.
Oh,
so
those guys,
yeah, so you got the Jomon. Yeah, so the Jomon period, there is a tree that is still alive, or at least it was while I was there. I'm not sure. It's been 12 years, but while I was there, it was still alive, and it was called Jomon Sugi, and you could hike up to it. It would take you over a day, so you had to stay up onto the mountain. I did not do that hike because I am not competent like that, but I stayed down in the like valleys in the lower parts of the island. But if you've ever seen Princess Mononoke,
yeah, I was going to bring up that because there's like these gigantic ancient forests in lots of Miyazaki's films. I've noticed like Studio Ghibli really loves those.
That is where he went for the inspiration.
Wow.
There is actually a Mononoke forest, Mononoke Mori, that you can hike to, and like that is where he sat and like took in the nature and drew, and all those little kodama from the movie.
Yeah, the guys with like the rotating heads.
Yes, so they're like everywhere all over the island because people like make carvings out of the trees and out of the there's beautiful huge like cedar sculptures, but then they also just have like little ones, and God, that place was gorgeous. If you ever get a chance, go there.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for telling me all about all this.
Yes, it's lovely. I love talking about it.
Sounds like a really interesting place. I think maybe I'll visit whenever I can, but only after I've visited Italy and Venice. That's actually the place I want to go.
Oh man, I would love to go to Italy. I've never been to Europe, and I would love it. So, I would encourage you after you've taken your trip to Italy, like if you want any specific tips on Japan. Like, I don't think I even mentioned about the JR Rail Pass, but that's a whole other topic to get into about trains and the public transportation there. But there's a rail pass, and it is very useful for tourists. So that's all I will say. Look it up.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Michelle. And I don't know, maybe we can talk again sometime about Japan and all the wacky things that go on there.
Absolutely, yes.
We start off at the end of the last episode, which ended with the Genpei War and the establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate. This was in 1185, which is also the same year as the end of the Third Crusade. And it ends with the empire, which at that point had become very weak. The real power wasn't in the hands of the emperor. It wasn't even in the hands of the retired emperors. It was more in the hands of the different samurai clans. And once they took power, they created an entirely new system called the shogunate. It had a system of officials, not nobles or monarchs, with the shogun at the top. The shogun is the leader of the daimyo, and the daimyo are the samurai lords. So the daimyo are in charge of the samurai, and the shogun is in charge of the daimyo. But that's how it's supposed to work in practice, or on paper. In practice, there were lower ranks like the shugo and the shiken, and they're lower-ranking officials who are supposed to be like regents to the shogun. But over time, kind of in the similar way as the cloistered emperors who were on paper retired, but were still pulling strings from behind the scenes. These types of lower officials who were actually doing stuff and were actually running the show were the real power in Japan. And this is a very unique kind of development because up until now, the leader of Japan had always been an emperor, and he could always trace his ancestral line back to the mythical Emperor Jimmu, who was supposed to be the ancient first founder of Japan. The Kamakura Shogunate also existed at roughly the same time as the Song Dynasty, or the early Kamakura Shogunate existed at the end of the Song Dynasty because they were eventually taken over by the Mongols. But before that, they copied them in several ways, including the spread of Zen Buddhism into Japan, and Chinese coins began circulating into the country, which made it much more viable to have a money economy. The Song Dynasty is known for being militarily weak, but very scientifically and economically advanced. And it's even been speculated that the Song Dynasty was actually the closest that any pre-modern society got to creating a fully industrialized capitalist empire before the modern age. And keep in mind that this dynasty was around at the same time as the Vikings and the Magyar invasions in Europe, who we'll be covering in the next episode. But for this shogunate, the Kamakura didn't last. They collapsed. And the reason why is that in the 1200s, China was fractured into several different dynasties, like the Song dynasty I just mentioned. In the north, there was the Jin dynasty, and the south, there was the Song. The Jin were actually not made of the ethnic Han Chinese. They were actually run by a different group of people called the Jurchens, later called the Manchus, who would take over China much later in history. But they were a northern Siberian people, and they were just much better at fighting. So they ran the show up in the north. But eventually the Mongols show up, and they conquer both of them, both the Jin and the Song. And they also conquer Korea, too. And from there, they begin preparing for invasions of Japan. They actually sent envoys to Japan and demanded that the Japanese submit to the Mongols. But instead, the Japanese, being very stubborn and independent, had all of those envoys beheaded. And that was their answer to them, that they wouldn't bow to the Mongols. So then in 1274, the Mongols strike back, and they begin a war against the Kamakura shogunate. And in this war, they're a bit more effective than the second one, because at the end of the day, the Mongols are really a nomadic land kind of specialized army. They're intended to send large numbers of horsemen over flat land, pillage settlements or cities or villages, siege them, and then leave and just create chaos wherever they go. And that's very effective if you're fighting off an enemy that's right next to you, and they have lots of stuff worth stealing. But the problem here is that Japan isn't right next to them. In order to get to Japan, they have to sail across the Sea of Japan using in the Tsushima Straits, using navies that were made by people who they had conquered, that being the Chinese and Koreans. So when they do that, they actually have some successes, and the Japanese are really not prepared to fight them. But because they usually don't fight off outsiders. Pretty much every war in Japan is fought between different Japanese factions, whether rival samurai or whether it's the what are they called? The samurai against the indigenous people, like the Ainu or the Imishi. But unfortunately for the Mongols, what they didn't know was that Japan is constantly getting hit by these storms called typhoons and tsunamis. So as they're trying to dock in Japan and trying to land more troops to invade, in 1281 and 1274, they get hit by a typhoon. It wrecks their fleet, and then the survivors get demolished by the Japanese. And they try that again 7 years later. And just like the first time, they get hit again by another typhoon, which just shuts down the whole invasion. Interestingly, this is also apparently one of the reasons why the katana exists, because before that, as I mentioned in the previous episode, they had this other type of sword called the chokuro, which is actually straight-bladed. But that type of sword apparently wasn't very good at getting through Mongol armor, which is made out of boiled leather, and it's very tough. It's not as tough as, say, plate mail or plate armor from Europe, which is, I think, arguably probably the best type of armor in the Middle Ages before modern ballistic plates and Kevlar. But it's still very effective, especially if you're a nomadic kind of military, and you have to be very light and mobile. But even though they won, this creates major problems for Japan because they're mostly used to fighting internal wars, and the veterans are being paid by getting loot from the people they defeat within Japan. But the Mongols aren't Japanese. They're not even really from the East Asia. They're more from North Asia. So because of that, they're not able to pay the many people who fought in this war, and it starts creating lots of disgruntled samurai who eventually rebel. And that leads to the collapse of the Kamakura shogunate. So, what happened after the shogunate? Well, in 1333, the emperor briefly returns for 3 years in what was called the Kenmu Restoration. But after those 3 years, the country split into different clans, with a northern court run by the Ashikaga clan and a southern court run by the Emperor Go-Daigo and his successors. And this, I think, kind of mirrors the Chinese era of the early Middle Ages when they were split between the northern dynasty and the southern dynasty. And and also is the era of the Southern Song and the Northern Jin right before the Mongols invaded. But in Japan, this is called the Muromachi period, and it lasts around to the end of the 1500s. But after about 60 years of this, in 1392, the South finally concedes to the North, that being the Ashikaga, and they unify the country, but for less than a century. Because I think less than 80 years after this, the Ashikaga shogunate, which united Japan, eventually they fall apart too, because there are still these divisions. There are many unruly samurai who just keep trying to rebel. And this eventually leads to the Onin War, which is, I believe, kind of similar to the Genpei War because you've got rival claimants to the throne, and you have different samurai clans who back different claimants. So eventually you have yet another civil war. And in this Onin War, it doesn't get resolved because during the Genpei War back in the 1100s, one of the clans won, and they solidified their rule over the country, and they created a new shogunate. But in this case, no one was able to take control. And so from the mid 1400s all the way up until the early 1600s, there's this era of just mass killing and chaos and destruction, where you have dozens of different clans trying to eliminate each other and become the leader of Japan. I kind of see this as like Japan's Somalia arc, because that's kind of what Japan was in this era. It was like Somalia, but in the Far East. I think this was actually also one of the most violent and brutal eras in Japan's history outside of World War II, because I think somewhere in the ballpark of millions of people were killed, both by the samurai themselves, but also by other factions who I'll get into a bit later, and also just by mass famines and plague epidemics that were caused by these wars. Interestingly, this is also when the famous movie from Studio Ghibli called Princess Mononoke takes place. And it shows the dynamic between an emperor who doesn't really control most of Japan and the power of rogue samurai lords who just can basically pillage and terrorize everyone as they please. So while this was definitely a very exciting time in Japanese history, it certainly wasn't a very enjoyable time to be around, especially if you weren't one of the people who were trying to take over. So unification was definitely something that I would assume most people in Japan wanted. And there were three of these great unifying figures in the late Sengoku Jidai who have since become very, very famous for their efforts. There was Oda Nobunaga, there was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally there was Tokugawa Ieyasu. So Oda and his clan are known for being especially violent, and they crushed basically everyone who got in their way, which worked for a while until Oda himself was actually backstabbed and killed by one of his own men named Akichi Mitsuhide. And he actually ended up killing himself in order to not be captured. Gunpowder weapons also were becoming much more common in this era, in the mid-1500s, because in 1543, the Portuguese brought in arquebuses. Those are early muskets to Japan, and it began this arms race for firearms because they realized that if you have guns, you can arm peasants and or just the samurai themselves. They can become very deadly, even if they're going up against men who outnumber them and are often better fighters. Apparently, there were gunpowder weapons in Japan before this time. For example, the Mongols actually did use gunpowder bombs during the invasion. It just wasn't very common. And if they did have guns, they were probably from China. And at this point, they weren't especially advanced. They were just still what you would call handguns. They didn't even have the shoulder stocks. The trigger mechanisms weren't very easy to use. They definitely worked, but they simply weren't effective enough to supplant other kinds of weapons like spears or swords or bows. And this also leads to one of the myths where it's believed that the samurai didn't use guns. I think that was part of the movie The Last Samurai, where they said that the samurai don't use guns because they don't see them as honorable. Well, that's complete garbage because the samurai loved using guns. They actually became some of the best gunners in the world, and they even developed certain techniques that were only developed in Europe at a later point, like the rank and file, where you'd have a bunch of guys with guns line up, shoot the guns, and then retreat to the back where you have another rank of men with guns, and they could shoot too. But it wasn't just the samurai fighting each other at this point. There were also other factions like the Ikoiki. They were radical Buddhist monks who, despite the Buddha himself being a pacifist who argued that there was never a good reason to use violence, they were extremely violent, and they were also very skilled martial artists. So in a strange way, they're kind of like the jihadists of Japan. But though I kind of compare them more to the Hussites, they were a populist movement that included radical monks and peasants alongside rogue samurai, or I guess in the case of the Hussites, that would be just like rogue soldiers. And eventually they were defeated because they were getting in the way of Nobunaga's plan to unify Japan. So eventually he had to use naval blockades and just mass burnings of temples to crush the entire movement. But outside of these, the radical monks, there were also the shinobi, or the ninjas. They were around before the Sengoku Jidai and arguably even before the Kamakura shogunate, because there were many people who decided to fight unconventionally. They put on disguises, they spied on people, and they also used secretive ways of killing that weren't part of the established honorable way of just fighting someone face to face. But during this era, they become very, very popular because there's a lot of intrigue going on. It's kind of like Game of Thrones, but in Japan. There's a huge spike in demand for assassins, scouts, and spies. And even the unifiers themselves, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa all used ninjas, both in order to get information about their enemies, but also to avoid being assassinated themselves. Though in Nobunaga's case, that unfortunately didn't help him. Though it's also important to remember here that it wasn't until after this era that the ninjas kind of get their modern image of being these people dressed in all black with masks, with throwing stars and strange kind of chain weapons like the kusarigama. That's a sickle that's attached to a chain, and at the end of the chain there's this heavy iron ball that they use to trip their opponents, then rush in and cut them up with a sickle. So Tokugawa eventually reunites Japan in the early 1600s. He didn't do all this himself. He basically just stood on the shoulders of Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, who were both dead by this point. And he eventually sent many men to fight in Korea because there were lots of samurai who now had nothing left to do because most of the fighting had already been done. So they tried to conquer the Koreans. But then at this point, the Ming Dynasty actually popped up and realized that if the Japanese succeeded in conquering Korea, they would be next. So they sent in their forces and they were able to push them back. This war is actually also one of the reasons why the Koreans and Japanese, even today, still have pretty bad relations, because I think somewhere in the ballpark of 1 million Korean civilians were murdered by the Japanese invaders. The Koreans were very effective with, they had naval technology. They had these armored boats that they could use to crash into the Japanese ships, and they were also very good at archery. But the Japanese were superior when it came to guns and musket infantry. And I believe there's an account that said that the Koreans were afraid of them because they could shoot all their arrows, but the Japanese could just retreat behind their shields or their blockades. They actually used these bamboo rolls of like bamboo to act as like pavises or shields. But whenever the Japanese opened fire with their muskets, it could penetrate just about anything. So after the failed Imjin Wars, because even though they killed many people, they eventually lost the war. Tokugawa finalizes the reunification of Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, which by then became a very extreme isolationist kind of state. So after the Tokugawa shogunate took power, Japan isolated itself, and this isolation didn't end until centuries later. And the reason why is because in the 1630s, 1638, radical Japanese Christians rebelled in southern Japan in Shimabara, and they actually managed to push back much larger samurai armies because they were very good at using the muskets and artillery. But the central government realized that this was an existential threat to them, because if they won, then it could lead to major rebellions everywhere. And because of that, they sent an army, I think, 7 to 10 times the size of the rebels, and they just overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. There's also a major crackdown on Christians and foreign missionaries because they believed that Christianity was just too foreign and too hostile to Japan. It had a very different value system, because the Japanese value system is that honor and loyalty are everything, but Christianity says humility and mercy and kindness is everything. And it also argues that everyone is kind of equal in a very spiritual kind of way, which the Japanese just don't really see as being true. Hierarchy and certain people just being superior than others is a very ingrained part of their way of thinking. So they bristle at the idea that everyone is secretly all equal to each other. So the shogunate implements a policy called sakoku, which bars the Europeans, really mostly the Portuguese and Spanish, and I believe the English too, but they make an exception from the Dutch for the Dutch because they're allowed to trade in another outpost called Dejima. But on the other hand, Japanese citizens also aren't allowed to leave the country because if they do and they get caught coming back, they'll simply be killed. So this is the Edo period. It lasts from the 1600s up until the mid 1800s. And it actually saw a major decline in Japanese military strength because it was actually very peaceful. There wasn't any of this ongoing civil wars or uprisings. On the other hand, it was actually a very good time to be an artist in Japan because there was all this artwork coming out. There was lots of literature and culture now that all the fighting had ended. Though there was the 47 Ronin incident in 1702, so this is many years after the establishment of the shogunate, a group of samurai who had failed their master went on a revenge spree, and they eventually cornered and killed the man responsible for his death, and then they committed ritual suicide. And at the time, this was very controversial, but as the years passed on, this eventually became kind of a symbol for what it meant to truly be honorable in the Japanese worldview. And another major figure in this time period is actually one of the most famous figures in all of Japanese history, period. His name is Miyamoto Musashi. He's considered the greatest duelist in all of Japanese history. And he's known for his book titled The Book of Five Rings, and it actually retells his first duel when he was only 13 years old and how he became an elite swordsmaster with this unique fighting style called Nichin Ichiryu, which is a dual wielding style. It's with a long katana in one hand and a shorter sword called a wakizashi in the other. And over his lifetime, Musashi is said to have actually won over 60 duels against other samurai or other duelists. And in some of those duels, his opponents had fully sharpened swords, but he was using a wooden training sword called a bokken, but he still beat them anyway. And in one of the cases, he even managed to kill the guy with just a wooden sword. So this went on for a while. That's from, I believe, 1603 or all the way to the 1800s, 1853. Which is when Commodore Matthew Perry from the U.S. Navy shows up and makes demands that the shogunate can no longer remain isolated. I believe the reason behind this is that this is at the height of the Industrial Revolution and the height of European and really just Western imperial power. And the reason for why they want Japan to open up is that they see it as a major a site for a coaling station because if you're trying to get to China or really anywhere in the Far East, you just want as many of these coaling stations as possible to refuel the ships. And because Japan has really fallen behind when it comes to the military, they haven't really fought in any wars since, I believe, the late 1590s. They're not really able to resist them. And at the same time, Japan is kind of keeping an eye out on what's going on around them because while this is going on, the Chinese were defeated by a very small group of Europeans during the Opium Wars, where both the British and later French and a few American mercenaries popped up and started crushing their armies, mostly using naval power, but also using musket infantry and I believe also rifle infantry. And also there's the problem that many of the Chinese citizens themselves realized that their own government was weak and decided to rebel. They launched the Taiping Rebellion. There's a very strange man named Hong Xiuquan in China who's met an American missionary from, I believe it was Kentucky or Arkansas, learned about Jesus, and then had a hallucination that made him believe that he himself was the brother of Jesus. So he started this rebellion, and over 20 million people were killed over the next decade. So seeing all these disasters going on nearby, the Japanese have realized that they couldn't keep going on this way. They couldn't fight off the Westerners in the traditional way. So instead what they decided to do is they decided to adopt them and work with the Westerners and try to modernize. But the problem is before they could do that, the shogunate had to go, and the Emperor of Japan was eventually restored to his throne in this time period called the Meiji Restoration in the mid to late 19th century. Starting in 1868, which is only 3 years after the American Civil War. The imperial and the shogunate troops clashed during the Boshin War, which led to the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, and it brought in the Empire of Japan. So, in conclusion, the shogunate era of Japan is probably the most famous, and largely it was because when the samurai were at their most important, and it's also where some of the best known samurai lived, from Miyamoto Musashi to Tokugawa Ieyasu. There's the greatest duelist of all time in Japan, and the man who eventually pieced Japan back together after over a century of division. And it's the source of many myths and legends, and it might even be the most romanticized eras in human history, now that I think about it, because it is very famous outside of ancient Rome or medieval Europe that also have a huge fan base. But it is so important to remember that these legends and myths are just that. They're stories about real, ordinary people who've done incredible things that have been inflated over time. Like Miyamoto Musashi defeating over 60 opponents with spears, bows, and even muskets. That's actually a legend that's around in Japan, that he defeated 60 people with ranged weapons and still managed to beat them. He was a very remarkable figure, but even this is kind of an unreasonable story that popped up long after he was dead. But perhaps the biggest takeaway from all of this is that in this tale of the shoguns, the Mongols, the samurai, and the emperors, it's that history always keeps moving. The Tokugawa shogun believed that Japan could be shut off and frozen in time, and that the outside world would never threaten Japan again. He believed that the nobles and the samurai could retain their positions indefinitely, but at the end of the day, he was completely wrong. In the 19th century and in the modern age, no one was untouched by the revolutions that swept over everything, not just political life, but also social and cultural life. And Japan was no exception to that. But instead of being conquered and becoming just another proud warrior culture extinguished by Western expansionism, Japan decided to evolve, and they decided to keep as much of their original identity as possible. And we will explore that in the next episode: the good, the bad, and the incredible. See you there. Thank you for joining us at the World History Addicts podcast. Please check out our Instagram page at World History Addicts podcast for more episodes and releases, and we hope to see you here again.